This video will contain spoilers for the War arc, the first arc of Vinland Saga, which is exactly the material that Season 1 of the anime adapted. Still, this will be in part a thematic analysis of the manga, even though I won't be mentioning or showing anything past chapter 54, and even though I will exclusively be using this part of the material to make my arguments, understanding a story also means gaining some insight on things it might try doing later. Just leaving this here because I'm paranoid and I want to be 100% sure about my spoiler warning. This video is still meant to help new fans understand the story, explain character motivations, and discuss the themes and the message of the manga. Personally, I believe that having some grasp of what a good series is doing will enhance your experience with it. It's why I think Vinland Saga is so rereadable. So, for a brief and probably unnecessary introduction to Vinland Saga. Historical manga written and illustrated by Makoto Yukimura, critically acclaimed, fantastic art. I'd say its biggest strengths are that it's character-driven, tightly structured and paced, and with a very strong thematic core. It's a series with a purpose. There is intent behind every character and story beat, and it's not afraid to change drastically and challenge the reader if it needs to. What's it about? It's an anti-war story about the Vikings, which is probably something you'd already figured after the first arc. Even so, it's partly why I put my extra spoiler warning into the video. You see, people frequently tend to, in my opinion, misread certain parts early into the series and then form misconceptions about it that hurt their experience later. It's something I noticed mostly during the time the anime was airing, where a lot of people new to Vinland Saga were talking about these earlier parts that are usually ignored by the fanbase. And listen, I'm not here to lecture those people for not getting it. Admittedly, the story may be intentionally vague sometimes. It's just a great excuse and a jumping off point to start discussing some of the main themes of Vinland Saga and how it conveys them through the characters. Now on to the actual topic of the video. If we go back to the beginning of the story, there's a character who is a big topic of debate and a source of some hot takes, I would say. And that character obviously is Thors Snorreson, the Troll of Yom. And Thorfinn, but let's talk about him another time. Now, I assume you know the gist of the situation. To summarize, Thors is an ex-Jomsviking captain that chose to abandon his life as a warrior in order to live peacefully with his family. Eventually, he is forced to go back to war, and he and his crew, including his son Thorfinn, are ambushed by hired mercenary Askeladd, who is after Thors' head. Here the two men have a very interesting exchange. After winning a duel against Askeladd, Thors refuses to cement his victory by killing him, and throws his sword away while exclaiming that a true warrior needs no sword. And then Askeladd kills him as to be expected. But why, you may ask? It makes no sense. Askeladd has agreed to let them go if he loses. Why is Thors not taking this chance to save his and his son's lives? Just because he feels conflicted over killing a random mercenary? Doesn't that make him look really bad? Well, in this video, I'm going to be explaining why Thors made that decision. But hold on for a minute, we gotta lay the groundwork first, cause the events around Thors' death are pretty complex. At this point in the story, a lot of character motivations are unclear, and little is explained through internal monologue or directly from other characters. This is why you may be confused here your first time through, and that's okay, you're not really supposed to fully understand all of what is going on. Generally, everything surrounding Thors is rather vague, in part because Thors is bad at expressing himself and only does so through a handful of inexplicit quotes with no real elaboration. The story will give you no direct answers. That's why Thorfinn is the protagonist. We're supposed to understand and learn alongside him through his experiences. Anyway, point is, we're going to have to dig through a lot of this arc and make some inferences. First of all, what are these hot takes I'm whining about that occasionally pop up? So, some people interpret Thors as this overly and unreasonably idealistic character who blindly follows his ideals purely for morality's sake. And although what he represents might be seen as admirable, Thors' way of life is naive in the context of the violent world of the Vikings that he lives in. This is either aimed as criticism of the character in Vinland for portraying him in such a positive light, or it's seen as the honest intention of the story. meaning that Vinland Saga is trying to tell us that Thors' rigid idealism and unwillingness to continue fighting were the death of him and resulted in Thorfinn's tragic fate. TLDR, the "he died, therefore he was wrong" mentality. This is not at all what Vinland Saga intends though. And while I get how you can come to this conclusion, I feel like for some people it is just a cynical rejection of the message. They expect an edgy action series that revels in the grittiness of its setting, just to get a story that criticizes that very thing. Also, as a side point here, I've seen a lot of blaming Thors and his anti-violence beliefs for what happened to Thorfinn, while ignoring Thors' violent past, which is the reason the entire situation came about in the first place, something that is emphasized a lot. The reality is that while Thors is a peaceful, empathetic man that hates hurting others, he manages to achieve the best result possible by refusing violence when he did. And for me to explain how that is so, and how the story recontextualizes Thors' actions, we first have to go through his past and motivations. We don't get to see a lot of Thors' previous life as a warrior, as it's not really that important. Apparently not to Thors either, since he deserted. But we do get an answer to why he left the Jomsvikings from that story he tells to Arya. Right after the birth of his first child, Ylva, Thor started growing scared of battle. Turns out that after he finally found something worth living for, a life dedicated to seeking glory and death on the battlefield wasn't that appealing anymore. It's during his time in Iceland that Thor and his ideology further developed to the true warrior we see in the story. My point with this is that the reason Thor became the person that he is because of his family, the single most important thing in his life. This is also why he empathizes so much with a runaway slave, who even mistakes Thors and Helga for his own family. It's cause the slave situation represents Thors' biggest fear, him being separated from his family and being forced to go back to what he now recognizes as the hell that he came from. Also, the scene with him offering 8 ewes to Halfdan for the slave in no way means to imply that Thor is willing to give up everything and endanger his family just to follow his ideals. Call it convenient if you will, but the deal with Halfdan was just a big inconvenience for the family. At the end of the day, Thor is still willing to go back to war if it means protecting his village. He is still willing to use his sword to protect Thorfinn, and he is still willing to give his dagger to Thorfinn, even if all those things seemingly go against his beliefs. So no, Thor would never risk Thorfinn's life. Everything he does during their encounter with Askeladd, he does in order to protect his son. And with all that out of the way, let's look at the main event in more detail. First of all, Thor and his crew are trapped. Escaping is just not an option. Also, Askeladd has them surrounded with archers, which pretty much means he's already won. There's simply nothing Thor can do about this. Only reason they're not shooting is because Askeladd's men are itching to fight and because they think they can handle this easily by themselves. But once Thor proves himself to be a real problem later, then the archers start complaining about Askeladd not giving them the signal. Basically, Askeladd holds all the cards in this fight and can end it whenever he wants, but also has a personal interest in Thor and wants to test him. I don't really need to explain Askeladd here, right? Well, I'm gonna do it anyway. Askeladd, at this point of his life, has given up on waiting for the salvation that Artorius represents, and is trying to gain power in the Danish society by building up his own military strength and by making connections with the Jomsvikings. But he still hopes to find a worthy leader, a hero in place of Artorius, who will finally make a difference in the world and save it from the barbarous warriors that plague it. His mother's tales really made a lasting impact on him. Now, the difference between waiting for Artorius and searching for somebody like him may not seem very important, but it is a big part of Askeladd's character. It shows us his discontent with the state of the world and how he gets increasingly more desperate as he gets older and realizes that he still hasn't achieved anything yet. Essentially, he has a midlife crisis. We can track Askeladd's concept of a hero and how he tries to materialize it throughout the first arc, with certain chapter titles making this clearer. He starts from waiting for Artorius in his younger years, to giving up and searching for a hero in his place, then trying to create one with Canute, and finally becoming the hero himself. And Thors is really intriguing to him for 2 reasons. One, he was a very capable Jomsviking leader who was even regarded as a hero. And 2, he deserted and abandoned life as a warrior. And we know Askeladd hates warriors. Back to the ambush though. Thors takes the initiative. He attacks one of the ships and takes out half of Askeladd's men with his bare hands. Why not kill them? Because he doesn't have to and doesn't want to. I could argue that this does in fact serve a practical purpose, but that's obviously not the point. Next up, he returns to his own ship and threatens the rest of the pirates to keep the situation from escalating. Here Thors makes certain observations. The pirates will not withdraw, the archers are there if they need them, the ships are too close. Even though Thors might be able to defeat them, he cannot start a fight here. If he did, he wouldn't be able to protect Thorfinn and the rest of his crew in the resulting chaos. So in an attempt to avoid that scenario, Thors evokes honor in combat by picking out and challenging Askeladd in a duel. This would allow him to continue fighting instead of surrendering, which at this point would probably be the second best decision. If Thors wins, Askeladd lets them go. If Askeladd wins, he takes Thors' head without a lot of casualties, as Thor says, which is mostly a hollow threat if you think about it. That's the only excuse Askeladd needs, of course, so Thors lucked out here. But Askeladd makes a half-assed oath using his father's name, meaning that he's not really intending to honor the agreement. At this point, I have to address the weird understanding Thors and Askeladd have. Thors explains that he figured out who the leader was by quote-unquote the smell, and Askeladd seems to understand, hinting that they're similar in some way. My guess is that Thors possesses the insight to read others, the ability Askeladd has and uses throughout the prologue, being able to figure out what kind of person somebody is just by briefly observing them. That's what the smell is. And it's not a coincidence. Both developed it while living and dealing with wicked men and taking on leadership roles over a band of warriors. It's not just these two either. Intentional or not, Viking leaders being proficient at reading people is kind of a pattern in the series, with very specific exceptions. But I digress. The point is, Askeladd and Thors can definitely read each other to some extent. After a rough start, Thors dominates the duel and wins by beating Askeladd in a battle of wits, and by reading his opponent better. I also want to point out that Thors goes out of his way to not kill Askeladd. His plan was to end the duel by wearing down and breaking his sword. And here we are. Thors has his sword on Askeladd's neck, and even though Askeladd tries to force him to do it by not admitting defeat, Thors just refuses to kill him. So is this the point where Thors, with no other way out, abandons himself to his ideals and desperately tries to reach that perfection that he seeks, the true meaning of love that Willibald preaches? No, I don't think so. Why not kill Askeladd then? You see, despite this predicament, Askeladd is still very much in control of the situation. He's in control of his men behind him, of the archers above. He practically already has Thorfinn as a hostage. For Thors to have any hope of protecting Thorfinn, he has to negotiate with Askeladd, the person who, for whatever reason, chose not to immediately riddle him with arrows. Cause if Thors kills Askeladd here, there's nothing to stop the rest of the pirates from attacking, which is something Thors can't risk, and Askeladd knows it. Just think about it for a second. Is Askeladd really prepared to die here just to not admit defeat in front of his men? Of course not, he hates them. He knows very well what is going on here, but he believes Thors will make the correct decision. Also, he may be all impressed with him here, but Askeladd doesn't really care about things like mercy and avoiding killing in general. Why does he respect Thors at all? Inconsistency? Well, no. Askeladd doesn't actually know that Thors spared all his men. He only finds that out in the aftermath, and he seems very conflicted about it. What Askeladd sees in Thors, and later Canute, is intelligence and critical thinking. Powerful men that haven't been corrupted by the warrior values of the Vikings. At the time, he just understood the strategic value of Thors' actions. But what about the oath, you may ask? Won't the pirates honor it if Askeladd dies? Well, it's just how these bands work. Let me elaborate. In chapter 26, while talking to Bjorn, Thorgrim basically admits that he's not so much loyal to Askeladd as he is to the money that comes with him. And that seems to be true for almost all of Askeladd's men, since they do betray him once things get rough, along with a fair amount of complaining, very reminiscent of that of the archers here. And while it may be in part because they've grown to resemble their leader, they're not unusual in that regard. They're the norm. Askeladd mentions this in chapter 18. The vast majority of the Vikings are motivated primarily by profit, which should be fairly obvious. Purer warriors like Bjorn or Thorkel are the exceptions. These mercenaries wouldn't stop for their dead leader's promise when a pouch full of gold is right in front of them. This scene gets further recontextualized later on, when Thorfinn and Askeladd find themselves in the exact same situation Thors was in. They are heavily outnumbered, cannot run away, and Thorkel has agreed to let them free if Thorfinn beats him in a duel. I like the following line of dialogue a lot. You don't just take down the king and get to walk away, which, aside being a nice bit of foreshadowing for the finale, is very relevant to both scenarios. Whether Askeladd is aware of it or not, he is following in Thors' footsteps by devising a plan that will allow the defeat of an enemy without killing them. In this case, Thorfinn is to let go of his weapon and then surprise attack Thorkel with a kick to the jaw when he lets his guard down. The plan does succeed, initially, but Thorfinn, being Thorfinn, messes everything up when his instincts take over and he tries to finish off Thorkel. And of course, Thorkel's men, more loyal in comparison to Askeladd's band, attack Thorfinn in order to protect their leader, despite Thorkel not wanting them to. Much like Bjorn taking Thorfinn hostage to protect Askeladd, and also because he is understandably ticked off when Askeladd offers leadership of the band to Thors. The prologue in general deals a lot with the dynamic between followers and leaders in the Viking society. Whether they are captains and warriors or kings and subjects, they benefit from one another and have an obligation to one another. The followers provide security, manpower and strength to the leader, and the leader controls, tempers, and efficiently uses that power to everyone's benefit. Thorkel's warriors will not accept having their leader killed over a meaningless duel, it's unfair to them. Askeladd's band won't tolerate his bad judgment, especially if they think it's selfishly motivated. And similarly, they won't feel obligated to keep a promise their leader shouldn't have made. It's the same thing with Svein too. He can't just do whatever he wants, he has to make sure that his subjects are content. So, as you can see, Viking bands behave in consistent and foreseeable patterns. Veterans like Thors and Askeladd should be more than capable enough to predict what could go wrong if Askeladd were to die. I glanced over Askeladd's offer of leadership, didn't I? Let's talk about that for a bit. The timing here is crucial, as it comes right after Thor shows restraint in using violence. Restraint, an attribute lacking in most Vikings, and maybe even in Askeladd himself. Much later, Askeladd conducts a similar kind of test with Canute, when he admits to having killed Ragnar to see if the prince can control himself and refuse meaningless revenge. And so, Canute passes and is rewarded Askeladd's loyalty. Thors passes as well, but he is obviously not going to accept the offer. After all, if the hero lives happily in his paradise, why would he ever choose to go back to hell? Well, in this case he is returning, but you get my meaning. Now Askeladd, with nothing else to gain from their exchange, has to stop stalling and finish the job. It's not that he doesn't respect Thors, but there's no excuse to give to his men now. He has to kill him. There is one last thing he can do for him though. Thors reminds Askeladd of the oath and shows that he has accepted his inevitable death by throwing away his sword. Askeladd now repeats the oath using Artorius' name instead of his father's. This time he's serious. So this is how Thors managed to save Thorfinn and Leif's lives through his sacrifice. It's not ideal, but ideal solutions rarely exist, and Thors' decisions and actions seem to have been the best ones. Finally, this entire sequence of events ironically ends with Ari, of all people. Young, inexperienced, and angry, he rushes at Askeladd without any understanding of the situation in a pathetic attempt to kill him while he is unarmed. The antithesis of everything that Thors represents. Fortunately, he is too incompetent to ruin anything. This part of the story, along with the introductory Iceland chapters, build the perfect thematic foundation for the rest of the series. The sword in Vinland Saga is used as an obvious symbol of violence, and especially lethal violence. So it's pretty simple understanding what this imagery, Thors throwing away his sword, means, and how important that is for this story. By demonstrating how violence is a reckless and sloppy solution, and how other methods, if one can find them, can be more efficient and effective, Thors rebels against the preconceived notions of the Vikings, and potentially of the readers too. He represents Vinland Saga's discontent with the world of the Vikings. Discontent with the rules ordained by the Norse society, by the will of the crown, or even the rules ordained by God and religion. And Thors isn't satisfied with his own self either. Despite the heights he's climbed, he believes that he's imperfect. In what he knows will be his last moments, he still longs for improvement. Askeladd too. As much as he mirrors the warriors he despises, he heavily criticizes the Viking culture and seems to grow disillusioned with his role in it. Unlike most other Vikings, Askeladd would rather employ negotiation, manipulation, and strategy into his plans instead of fighting, which he usually tries to avoid. Just like he says in chapter 46, only a fool gives in to his rage, screams his bloody head off, and waves his weapon about. When asked what he believed in, a Viking once said, "I believe in my own strength and nothing else." This quote is how the chapter right after Thors' sacrifice begins, while we are presented with a bloody axe raised towards the sky. Vinland Saga is all about turning that statement on its head. Succumbing to the ways of the sword and raising your weapon, at least when done impulsively, inelegantly, without any thought or good reason or any care for human life, that is not strength, but weakness. 'Cause the sword has a magic of deception to it. It whispers in the ear of its bearer. "Now, draw me, use me," it says, while exploiting their weaknesses and showing them illusions. Illusions of wealth, fame, approval, praise and riches. Illusions of revenge and cathartic vengeance, of protecting one's own pride. Illusions of power, ambition, status, and superiority to others. Illusions of being in control. But if one person draws his sword, next thing you know, everybody's drawing theirs. And then hell awaits. Death and misery. Anger calls to anger, and in the face of vengeance, more vengeance arises. Once begun, nobody can stop it. And that's it, end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed it, although I don't expect a lot of people to watch this. The script turned out to be a bit all over the place, but I think I managed to cram most of my thoughts into it. You know, this video making business is harder than I thought. I think my audio still sounds like shit, but I'm content with it for now. And learning to speak English not completely terribly as a non-native speaker, annoying to say the least. And I haven't even started editing. But still, I want to make more Vinland Saga content, preferably faster this time. I have a bunch of ideas, and this manga is severely underanalyzed. So I guess I'll see you then.